The shock here is not just that King Charles appears to be drawing a hard line around who really counts inside the monarchy. The real shock is what that line says about blood, status, access, and the limits of belonging. Because when people heard that Charles was leaning on a century-old royal rule to shut down expectations around Camilla's wider circle, it sounded like palace drama. But the deeper story is much colder than that. It is about the institution reminding everyone that marriage may open the door, but it does not rewrite the map. And in this family, that difference changes everything. If you enjoy this kind of royal breakdown, make sure you stay with me all the way through, because this story is not really about one title or one technical rule. It is about what Charles may be trying to protect, what Camilla can never fully control, and why the future of the crown still comes down to one brutal question: who belongs at the center, and who only ever stands near it? On the surface, the headline sounds explosive. A dramatic move, a ruthless king, an old law dragged out of the archives like a weapon. And yes, that is the part that grabs attention. But when you actually slow the story down, what makes this so revealing is not the noise, it is the message. Charles is not simply dealing with etiquette or paperwork. He appears to be reinforcing a boundary that has always existed inside the monarchy, even when people tried to pretend otherwise. Camilla may be queen, but her wider family is not the royal family in the way William, Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis are. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting under all the emotion. And that is why this lands harder than it first looks. Because Camilla's whole journey into the center of royal life was never simple. She was not the fairy tale bride. She was not embraced instantly. She was not handed effortless public affection. For years, she represented difficulty, controversy, history, and the long shadow of a love story that came with damage attached. Her rise depended on patience, careful image management, and one very important thing, the idea that service could eventually soften resistance. Over time, that strategy worked better than many expected. She became a steady figure, not glamorous in the movie star sense, not especially adored in the mythic sense, but useful, present, disciplined, and increasingly normalized. That matters, because it changed how people saw her position. Camilla stopped looking like a temporary compromise and started looking like part of the furniture of the monarchy. Quietly, that makes people around her feel more secure too. Her children, her grandchildren, her long-standing social network, her personal circle, all of them inevitably moved in the reflected glow of royal proximity. Not official royals, no, but close enough to be noticed, close enough to trigger speculation, close enough for palace watchers to keep asking the same question in different ways. How far does Camilla's world extend into the official world of the crown? That is where this gets interesting. Because the monarchy has always been full of blurred lines in public and very sharp lines in private. At garden parties, state occasions, funerals, jubilees, and coronations, people can appear side by side and still occupy completely different categories in the royal mind. One person may be family, another may be royal family, another may be institutionally essential, and another may simply be included by kindness, marriage, or circumstance. From the outside, those distinctions can look petty. From inside the palace, they are the architecture. So when the conversation turns to a 1917 palace rule, what people are really talking about is the old system designed to define rank and protect the royal core. The 1917 framework, created in the reign of George V, was meant to narrow who could carry certain royal styles and titles. It was about slimming before slimmed monarchy became a modern slogan. It was about preventing the crown from becoming crowded with relatives who had the shine of royalty but not the constitutional purpose. In plain English, it was a fence, a polite one, a historic one, but still a fence. And Charles, of all people, understands why that fence exists. He has lived his entire life inside the pressure of symbolism. He knows that monarchy survives not because it includes everyone, but because it convinces the public that some roles are sacred, specific, and not endlessly expandable. That is one of the hardest truths about royal life. Warmth helps, personality helps, popularity helps, but structure matters more. The crown does not want to become a social club made glamorous by association. It wants to remain a hierarchy shaped by succession, bloodline, and duty. Now think about what that means for Camilla. Camilla is central to Charles emotionally and personally. She is his wife. She is his companion. She is the woman who, after decades of scandal and criticism, ended up beside him on the throne. That is a remarkable transformation. But even with all of that, she cannot transplant her entire family into the bloodstream of the monarchy. Her children are not in the line of succession. Her grandchildren do not become royal by osmosis. Her friendships do not turn into constitutional relevance just because she has reached the top beside the king. And that is exactly why any move that invokes old palace law feels so brutal. Because it is not just a legal reminder, it is an emotional demotion. It says, in effect, yes, Camilla is queen, but the institution still stops where Camilla begins. That is what stings. That is what makes the atmosphere shift, and that is why so many people instantly read a deeper tension into it, whether or not anyone at the palace ever says a word out loud. Here is the thing. Charles has spent years talking, directly and indirectly, about a leaner monarchy. Fewer working royals, a tighter central unit, more discipline around who does what and why. On one level, that sounds modern and practical. On another, it is deeply strategic. A smaller monarchy is easier to defend in a skeptical age. It costs less in public patience. It looks less indulgent. It puts the emphasis back on the sovereign, the heir, the heir's family, and a limited number of senior figures who carry most of the workload. That model naturally favors William and Catherine. And once you understand that, the rest becomes clearer. The future of the monarchy is not being built around social circles or blended family sentiment. It is being built around succession visibility. Charles knows he is a transitional king in one very important sense. However serious his reign may be, the long-term emotional future of the institution rests heavily on William and his children. George is not just a child in the family. He is the visual promise of continuity. Charlotte and Louis are not just beloved young royals. They are part of the image of stability that keeps the royal story alive beyond one reign. That is where the core is. That is where the public gaze naturally settles. And that is why everyone else, even very close people, becomes secondary when the palace starts talking in structural terms. Which brings us back to Camilla's circle. Her side of the family has always occupied an awkward symbolic space. They are respectable, visible, and tied to the Queen's personal world, but they are not constitutional assets in the same way the Wales household is. They do not embody the future crown. They do not carry the monarchy's generational legitimacy. They may appear at private events. They may be welcomed warmly on personal terms. But official centrality is another matter entirely. A king may love his wife and still decide that the institution cannot afford any confusion about who stands inside the line and who stands just outside it. That sounds harsh. Because it is harsh. But the monarchy often survives through harsh clarity disguised as tradition. And if Charles is indeed using the spirit of the 1917 rule to draw that line, then what looks like a personal blow is also a strategic message. It is a message to courtiers, to commentators, to extended relatives, and maybe even to Camilla's allies themselves. Do not mistake nearness for permanence. Do not mistake affection for inheritance. Do not mistake the Queen's presence for a royal entitlement that spreads outward. That is why this is bigger than gossip. It touches one of the oldest nerves in royal history. Bloodline versus marriage in access. The monarchy may soften its language over time, but it never really escapes that issue. Who is born into the thing? Who marries into it? Who works for it? Who benefits from it without truly carrying it? Those questions have haunted generations of royal households, and they never stop being sensitive because they are never only about rank. They are about emotional worth, about recognition, about public respect, about whether someone is merely tolerated, truly accepted, or quietly held at arm's length. Camilla's life inside the royal family has always involved that dance. She is not an accidental bystander. She knows the game. She understands codes, timing, discretion, and patience better than most. In some ways, that is exactly why this kind of development would cut so deeply if it has indeed been felt inside her orbit. Not because Camilla expected to remake the Constitution in her family's image, but because she knows how meaning works in palaces. A line on paper becomes a mood. A technicality becomes a signal. A signal becomes a hierarchy everyone can feel, even when nobody names it directly. And once a hierarchy is felt, relationships change. People become more careful, more alert, more self-protective. Those who believed they were secure start wondering whether they misread the room. Those who were already skeptical feel vindicated. Courtiers pay attention to who is being centered and who is being quietly managed back into the margins. That is how royal power often operates now. Less thunder, more adjustment, less public humiliation, more invisible narrowing. But the real issue is not just Camilla. The real issue is Charles's reign and what he wants it to stand for. For all the emotion around his personal history, Charles has always cared deeply about the seriousness of monarchy. He may be sensitive, expressive, and at times visibly wounded by criticism, but he is not casual about the crown. He has waited too long, studied too much, and internalized too much history to treat kingship like a decorative reward. He knows the monarchy only survives if it can still project discipline, and discipline, in royal terms, often means disappointing people close to you. That is what makes the story feel so cold. Because if a king is willing to reinforce old boundaries even when they affect the woman closest to him, then he is telling us something about his priorities. He is saying the institution comes first. He is saying affection cannot sprawl into constitutional privilege. He is saying the royal center must remain legible, and whether people admire that or resent it, it is a very old royal instinct. Now some viewers will hear all this and say, fine, but is it really fair to talk about Camilla's royal circle as if she ever expected full integration? And that is a fair question. The point is not that she was trying to turn her family into princes and princesses overnight. The point is that symbolism matters in this world more than almost anything else. Inclusion at the edges can create expectations, or at least impressions. Public appearances can fuel assumptions. Soft status can begin to look like real status. And when the palace suddenly reasserts the rules, it feels like a correction, even if the correction was technically always there. That is why these moments never stay small for long. They become stories about favor and exclusion, about who got too comfortable, about who never fully belonged, about whether Charles is quietly protecting William's future path from any blur or complication. And honestly, that last point matters more than people think. Because William's monarchy, or the future monarchy built around him, will almost certainly be even tighter than Charles's, more focused, more image-conscious, more brutally selective about who represents the crown. William and Catherine symbolize the line the public understands immediately. They look like continuity. They look like the direct route from one reign to the next. Any ambiguity around that center is a risk the palace does not need. So if Charles is already clearing the edges, he may not just be making a decision for the present. He may be preparing the ground for the next phase of the institution. And if that is true, then Camilla's world was always going to face limits. Not because she failed. Not because Charles does not value her, but because her rise was personal and political, not dynastic in the same way. She became queen by standing beside the king, not by creating the future line of the crown. That distinction is everything. It is subtle in casual conversation and enormous in royal logic. That is also why this kind of story hits an emotional nerve with the public. People instinctively understand the human side of it. A wife reaches the highest place beside her husband, yet her own wider circle still cannot fully cross into the inner chamber. There is something almost tragic in that. Not melodramatic, just sad in a very royal way. It speaks to the loneliness built into hierarchy. It says that even victory has limits, even arrival is partial. Even the queen cannot erase certain walls. And maybe that is the most revealing part of all. Because for years, Camilla's public rehabilitation was framed as proof that time and service can change everything. And in one sense, they did. She moved from scandal to stability, from rejection to acceptance, from controversial partner to crowned queen. That is no small transformation. But what this latest tension seems to reveal is that acceptance has layers. There is personal acceptance. There is ceremonial acceptance. There is public acceptance. And then there is institutional absorption, the deepest and hardest form of acceptance of all. That one remains selective. That one remains guarded. That one does not expand easily. So when people say Charles has used a 1917 palace law to destroy Camilla's royal circle, the phrase sounds brutal, but it points to something real beneath the drama. Not necessarily destruction in the cartoonish sense. More like restriction, contraction, a reminder of limits, a refusal to let proximity harden into inherited standing. That may not be as flashy as the headline, but in royal terms, it is actually more consequential. Because once the palace reasserts limits, everyone hears them. And the silence after that can be louder than any official statement. So what happens next? That is the question hanging over all of this. Does Camilla simply absorb the message with the same pragmatism that carried her through decades of scrutiny? Do her allies step back and accept that the institution has spoken? Or does this leave a quieter bruise inside a marriage and a court already balancing history, loyalty, and the politics of legacy? We may never get a dramatic confession. That is not how this family works. The monarchy survives by letting tension settle into atmosphere instead of language. But atmosphere matters. It changes posture. It changes confidence. It changes who seems central and who suddenly looks less secure than they did the day before. And that is why this story matters. Not because one old rule was pulled off a shelf, not because a sensational headline needed fresh fuel, but because it exposed something ancient at the heart of royal life. Love is one thing, rank is another. Marriage can elevate, it does not automatically absorb. Nearness can feel powerful, it is not the same as permanence. And the crown, even in its modern form, still draws its hardest lines where emotion would rather blur them. So maybe the biggest takeaway is not that Charles struck at Camilla, it is that he may have reminded everyone, including her world, that monarchy is never most honest when it is smiling for the cameras. It is most honest when it decides who counts, who continues, and who must remain just outside the frame. And if that is what this moment really revealed, then the tension has not disappeared at all. It has only gone quiet, which in royal terms is often when it becomes most important. Tell me what you think. Was this a necessary move to protect the structure of the monarchy, or did it expose a colder side of Charles's reign than many people expected? And more importantly, do you think Camilla was ever truly meant to bring her world fully into the royal center, or was that boundary always there waiting to be enforced?